chapter 4, entitled Tyranny is Tyranny. Um, the chapter, it starts off, it dives right into an important concept, which is uniting people through symbology. In this case, it was the symbology of nationhood. It promoted all that, the pomp and circumstance of nationhood, in an effort to amalgamate all, not all, but a variety of lower classes who were in tumult for a variety of reasons, and to kind of herd them all and all their rebellious energies under the umbrella of freedom from British reign. Now, this all went on. It started basically around the 1760s and 1770s. Talk post-French and Indian War. The colonies were growing economically powerful, and they were sort of getting their feet under them. And the British were taking full advantage of this, basically milking it for all it was worth in terms of filling their coffers to pay off wars and a variety of other activities. One of the quotes from the book is, they created, this was talking to the founders, they created the most effective system of national control devised in modern times and showed future generations of leaders the advantages of combining paternalism with command. I think that's pretty poignant. The one thing Zinn went on, sort of on a side comment, that he didn't believe that it was a conscious conspiracy, but rather an accumulation of tactical responses. Personally, I disagree with that. There's just an aside to the aside. You kind of got to be careful with the term conspiracy because it gets spun off into a lot, nuttiness. But really, a conspiracy, by definition, is just a person or group of people, planning out any event ahead of time. So, I think that this was planned out. The revolution was a long time in coming, and the power structure of America, or of the colonies to become America, they saw what was to be had, and that basically, in a lot of ways, they emulated the British power structure, with some important changes, of course, but that they saw that if they were the bosses, instead of having to pay off, basically being the middlemen towards a higher level of bosses, which in this case was Britain, and I think it wasn't just a response to random events. It was planned. Anyway, let's see. During this time, like I said, it was 1760s into the 1770s, before the actual Declaration. The separation between the wealthy and working classes grew sort of exponentially. These lower classes struck out, rioting, petitioning the upper classes in the legal system for different types of recognition and justice. And again, going along, it defines this, or it details it in the book, but it sort of, I think, lends itself to my way of thinking rather than the non-conspiracy, is that the artisan leadership sort of sprang up and co-opted the movements of all these the rabble riots. That the power structure of the colonies had to walk a fine line between steering the anti-elitist sentiments that all these lower classes shared, but they wanted to steer those sentiments towards the British and away from their own power structure. And like I said, it's sort of it was a gray area because the lower classes didn't see wealth as wealth, but the power structure of the colonists definitely made an effort to define that, and in an effort to shape the revolution. It went on to list who was disenfranchised and why. It's the usual suspects: the tenant farmers, the labor class. Basically, they were propertyless. There's the tenant farmers. If they had a bad crop, not only did they owe multiple layers of taxation, but they had, their rent was due, and there wasn't much of a grace period. There's the wealthy landowners would send in, you know, through the backup of the legal system, basically send in different types of militias and hired bully boys to boot the people off their land. They also, these people, by American or by colonial and by British, they by both the colonial and the British, they were impressed into military service, and they were forced to quarter British troops who were stationed in the colonies. The lower classes really made up the lion's share of the population, as in all times. Also, I thought it was interesting. It talked about some of the tenant farmers in the South who were, you know, economically on the outside of power, but it really said that the vast majority of Southern farmers didn't even own slaves, because it was the big plantation owners is where the need for the slaves were economically, and that even, I mean, obviously, setting aside just for a moment the moral, you know, qualms about slavery, which of course like are unquestioned, but you know, anybody could use that free labor on the farm, but that they neither had the money or the ability to really perpetuate slavery. It was more in the upper classes where the capitalistic agriculture was going on. So I thought that was kind of interesting too, because you sort of just think of slavery in the South and not in the North, but really even in the South, while slavery was vast, it wasn't over all levels of farming. It was really only at the top, although in great numbers. Let's see. They struck out these lower classes in a variety of ways. They would unseat the judges. You know, they would break out wrongly arrested people of their leadership. They even, in the North, they would pillage the establishment homes and buildings of the tax collection and of some of the wealthy merchants that, you know, utilized unfair practices. But again, the wealthy leveraged the merchants and the skilled labor who were above the labor classes but still connected to them more directly, and they used those classes as, like I said, the artisan leadership in an effort to co-opt all these rebellious tendencies. There was many. there was multiple notations of times when they would get a parade or a protest going using this artisan leadership, but that towards the end of it, once the flowering speeches were made, that the mob would turn it into a riot and damage private property and go after some of the colonial leadership's homes and buildings. And then, of course, the artisan leadership would speak out against this type of behavior. So I mean, it was evidence to me that it was definitely a steered movement. They hired the wealthy colonial establishment would hire patrols, and they would put in place during the later protests after some of the riots took place to guard their property. And I didn't mention this quote in the book, but it came to mind, is half of the poor can always be hired to kill the other half. You know, in the money system, you can always, if there's a lot of people without jobs and a lot of them most of those people are going to a protest, you can always hire some of the ones without jobs who will be more than willing to, you know, lay the lumber on those who are protesting. Like I said, as these things unfolded, the establishment of the colonies did their best to manage this ire and continue to funnel the resentment and even fan the flames, but direct it towards Britain. And I think it's evidence too. There's a quote by John Adams. It said, these tarrings and featherings, the breaking open of houses by rude and insolent rabbles, in resentment of private wrongs or in pursuing of private prejudices and passions, must be discountenanced. And I thought that sort of went right to the heart of it too, is that, you know, they wanted the people, the rabbles, to be up in arms, but it wasn't okay for them to be up in arms for their own reasons. You know, they had to be, it was only, you know, legal to be up in arms for the authorized rebellion and not for their own rebellions. And again, it went into listing many details of different varieties and accounts of these types of happenings. Of course, the propaganda campaign went into full force. The pamphleteering, Thomas Paine, I believe, he, you know, had I forget what it was called. I didn't make a note of it, but it was a pamphlet that was well read throughout the colonies. Really spoke to the heart of the lower classes, and basically it perpetuated the ideas of throwing off the yoke of unjust government from afar. You know, to separate from the costly wars from the monarchy, and of course they used the romantic talk of government for and by the people. And then it went into right before the Revolution, and of course the Declaration of Independence, and of course the most notable sentence of the second paragraph, I'll go ahead and read quickly. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. There's a lot in there, of course. Well, I'll just say that the chapter winds up after getting into the writing of the Declaration and some of the surrounding movements, but with the discussion of the development of democratic government in both Britain and the colonies to become America, and how the lower classes were utilized in the actions, but by and large were left out when dividing the spoils. And I think that's a lot of key stuff, because the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, while of course, you know, there's a lot of great statements in there, but you have to put in the perspective of who they're talking about, and you know, it's easy to get behind it for sure, but you know, when you say all men are created equal, even in those times they were leaving out, of course, blacks, Indians, women, and really most of anyone without property. So, you know, it sounds great, and of course, you know, all men are created equal. How can you argue with that? But really, the language in a lot of and this is the beauty of the legal system, is that there's so many vagaries that can be, you know, just beaten to death and taken a variety of different ways to the point of, you know, being unrecognizable, and that, you know, and this is broad generalization by me, of course, but that this is just, it goes on and on, where they can use language to initiate things and to light fire under people in the name of right, but then at the end of the day, who's left holding the bag? And I think, you know, almost 250 years later, I think it's you know, it's pretty easy to see that really the reign of Britain was sort of, the torch was passed to the Americas, and that while there was a lot of great things that happened during the Revolution, the money system and the power structure were what was really at the heart of the matter.